So we're starting. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending where you are. And welcome back to Gatty lectures of the academic year 2021. My name is Anna. I'm a student at Asian Studies here at Cornell, co-host of Gatty lectures this year. I also have wonderful and gorgeous Kara on your screen, who is another co-host. Of course, we have our wonderful presenter, and we have our colleague Connor, who is the student at the anthropology department here at Cornell, and he will be introducing our wonderful speaker today. Before we will start the introductions, let me just take a few minutes to run through the logistics, because we're using the Zoom webinar format for today's talk. It means that we cannot share everybody's screens. We're just going to have our presenter and the panelists. But to compensate that, you have chat function at the bottom. Chat runs all the time through the talk. Feel free to say hello to some colleagues and friends you see are here with you tonight as well. And we also have the Q&A button. So what we actually ask you to do is, for the Q&A session with our presenter, please submit your questions to the Q&A. We will be picking questions only from Q&A tab, not from the chat tab. And the talk is going to be approximately 30 to 45 minutes. And then from the generosity of our presenter, we are happy to pick up as many of your questions as we will have, minding time frame, of course, thinking about 30 minutes of Q&A, so you'll have plenty of time to have a wonderful conversation and sharing session with your presenter. And without further ado, let me introduce Connor. Connor is a third-year PhD student in anthropology here at Cornell, and his research focuses on religion, economy, and bureaucracy in Indonesia. His dissertation research, COVID permits, will ethnographically examine the halal tourism initiatives on the island of Lombok and how it relates to broader historical projects of Islamic reform and identity construction in Lombok. So on this note, I'm handing over to Connor to do the honors of presenting our wonderful speaker for today.
Great. Can you hear me, Anna? Give me a heads up. Okay. Thanks for that introduction. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's Gatty speaker, Sharyn Davies. Professor Davies is currently the Associate Professor at Monash University, where she also leads the Feith Indonesian Engagement Center. She received her PhD in Asian Studies and Anthropology from the University of Western Australia. Her ethnographic work aims to rethink the ways gender operates, with particular attention to those subjects less represented in scholarly literature in Indonesia, so not limited to lesbians, bisexuals, androgynous shamans, or bisus, and others straddling various identity categories. She's produced 2 monographs based on her engagements in Bugis, South Sulawesi, both of which aim to ethnographically explore the construction of gender and sexual subjectivities and take queer and feminist theory to task in various ways in doing so. Her 2014 edited volume with Linda Bennett, titled Sex and Sexualities in Contemporary Indonesia, won the Ruth Benedict Prize for Best Edited Collection. Davies has a number of visiting positions at Peking University, Cambridge, and most recently Sydney University. Beyond, though related to gender and sexuality, she's also recently published on Thai women fighters and other topics like HIV, police, politics, and also in Indonesia's complicated research bureaucracy, as I discovered in writing this. So without further ado, we want to welcome you to delivering our Gatty lecture today. Thank you, Sharyn.
Thanks, Connor, and welcome everybody. I'm just going to now try and share my screen by clicking that one and sharing. Okay. All right, let's start with that. Right, thank you, and thank you all for bearing with us through those few technical difficulties. We'll probably have some others. I can see my neighbour has chosen this time to mow the lawn, and my children will no doubt come home any moment, but we will make do, because I know I'm not the only one going through such an interesting time at the moment. So thanks so much for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be presenting today. And I guess this is one of the small silver linings that we have during this COVID times, is that I can participate in these events and other global things. So that's one small silver lining that we have. So I'm talking today about the morality push that Indonesia is undergoing, and exploring the drivers and the consequences of this moral push. And we'll be arguing that these are far broader than just a few people wanting to criminalize sexuality. And I want to talk more fully about those drivers and consequences shortly, but I wanted to start with something that has been at the top of my social media feeds for the last few weeks, and that's Indonesia's omnibus law. So I'm not focusing on this law today, and I don't particularly know much about it, other than it's a law that was pushed through Parliament over a single weekend, and it repeals many workers' rights that have been long and hard fought for. And it also repeals many of the protections that have been afforded to the environment. The lack of information regarding the bill's content is one of the reasons that it's so controversial. And some are even saying that the government has deliberately caused and created confusion at a time when protesting against new laws brings so many risks. And so why I mention the passage of this law here is because I think it's symptomatic of the larger push towards anti-democratic ends in Indonesia. And restrictions of sexual and gender expression sit right alongside this. And there are many other scholars who've looked at this in far more detail than me, and particularly at Indonesia's anti-democratic moves. And Marcus Meitzner springs to mind, as well as Verdi Hadiz, Ed Aspinall, David Bouchier, and Greg Feely, who I think is presenting at exactly the same time as me now on a topic to do with that. So what is clear is that moves towards more authoritarian populist ways of running Indonesia are growing and detrimentally impacting gender and sexual diversity. Okay, so there should be spoiler alert on your screen. All right. There we go. So I know many of you are very busy with multiple commitments, and a big one being at 9 o'clock if you're around the Cornell area, where I think the last presidential debate will be going on, which I'm sure many people are keen to listen to. So I'm not going to talk for too terribly long, just 30 minutes. And for those of you who can't stay and need to pop in and out or leave early, I wanted to give you a bit of a heads up as to what the talk will conclude at the end. So the first key takeaway is that there are growing restrictions around consenting adult sexuality, including potentially the criminalisation of all sex outside of marriage. And this is a dangerous move, and it's worrying particularly because Indonesia has never criminalised homosexuality. It has a different colonial past, different law system. So this will be the first time that it's criminalised homosexuality, and the first time really that the government has considered it well within its remit to do that. And secondly, I want to talk about the drivers of this push. And we tend to think about religion being first and foremost, and that's obviously a key, but there's also education, there's politics, there's social drivers, and many others. And third, I'll talk about the devastating consequences of such moves for so many, not just the LGBT community. And finally, I'll show how COVID is exacerbating these consequences, not just because it's diverting medical attention away from sexual and reproductive health care, but also because COVID is providing justification for increased overt punitive surveillance and indeed vigilantism. So I wanted to just have a couple of points before I started. I've been working as a queer ally researching issues of gender and sexuality in Indonesia since I started my PhD fieldwork in 1998. And I talked a bit more about that yesterday in a podcast with Michael Miller, also for Cornell. And in many ways, that was a pretty heady time. There were mass protests, President Suharto was overthrown, and all sorts of progressive things seemed possible. And so it is, in some ways, with forlorn eyes that I reflect on that time, with its hope and promise, and compare it to where we are now. And of course, my positionality shapes my thinking and my work, and the hope and promise I envisaged is encased in a kind of frame that believes that at the very least, consenting adult sexual and gender practices that really have no impact on anyone else should not be criminalised. And I'm also cognizant that the last thing the world needs is another straight, cisgender, white Western woman talking for the subaltern. But I have a platform, and I think those of us with platforms, it behooves us to speak in a responsible and empathetic way, particularly where, as in the case of Indonesia, it is increasingly difficult and downright dangerous for many people to speak out. This talk comes with a trigger warning. It's quite distressing to hear about the goings on and the punitive regulation and surveillance that is occurring. And I've taken images from Creative Commons and attribute them at the end. So this talk is about Indonesia's moral turn, and you might very legitimately ask, is there an immoral turn in Indonesia? And that's a super important question to address before talking about what's driving it. And even more fundamentally, what does the term immoral turn mean? So the phrase immoral turn is just a useful way I've developed to capture things that are happening in Indonesia. I suggest that Indonesia's immoral turn shares many of the features with the nation's illiberal turn, the conservative turn, and the authoritarian turn. And it can perhaps be thought of as a smaller part of these larger trends. Immoral turn is simply then a way of drawing together the raft of changes across the archipelago under what might broadly be considered a moral banner. At its most basic, morality is concerned with distilling right from wrong, good from bad. And while ethics may be codified in law, so we have codes of ethics, morals are often concerned with more private things, where there is no right or wrong, or where the state does not or should not intervene. For instance, many people might consider adultery immoral, but few states send people to prison for it. I'm not using immoral turn as a complex philosophical concept, merely as a heuristic to suggest that many of the changes being pushed through in Indonesia are pitched as upholding morality and getting rid of immorality, but that this push towards a moral turn is viewed by many as immoral. I focus in this talk on sexual morality and specifically attempts in Indonesia to frame sex outside of marriage as so immoral it should be criminalised. So, is there any evidence of a moral turn? Well, yes, and we see signs all over the place, literally. This one is from the social science faculty at the University of Indonesia, and it's telling students what to wear. So jeans, t-shirt and a jacket are okay, but the jeans can't have any kind of fading, the t-shirt can't be tucked in, and the jacket has to be on, and the same with the guys. But perhaps the most cited evidence is the 2008 ratification of the pornography law, which came, not coincidentally, just 2 years after the release of the inaugural Indonesian issue of Playboy. While the law is a watered-down version of the original, it still severely restricts expression. For instance, we can see in Article 1 here that pornography is pictures, conversations, movement of the body in public, which contain obscenity or sexual exploitation, which violates moral norms. So given this sweeping definition, it is not surprising that the law has been used to persecute many people. Peter Pan singer Ariel was the first case tried in 2011, and he was sentenced to 3.5 years in jail for making a private, consensual sex tape with his girlfriend. But while the pornography law stands as a watershed moment in Indonesia's moral turn, the foundations of this turn were laid by the early 2000s. Indeed, by 2004, various provinces across Indonesia had taken advantage of decentralization to implement draconian laws against sexuality. Palembang, for instance, became just one of many provinces to criminalize prostitution. And from my understanding, the law has been interpreted as defining homosexuality as prostitution. And this trend continued for the next decade. And we can look at 2 examples related to policewomen to exemplify this. So much of my research is focused on policing, and in particular police women and policing women. And women have been part of Indonesia's police force since 1948. Yet in 2005, they were banned from wearing the Muslim headscarf on duty, I think for the first time. But many women fought against this ban. And in 2013, Muslim policewomen won the right to veil on duty. And they did that by drawing partly on a moral discourse that they should be allowed to follow their religious beliefs while on duty. And so this is one example of where a moral discourse was invoked to bring about change. A second example came just a year later. Human Rights Watch reported in 2014 on the ongoing practice of virginity testing for women as part of police recruitment. Some police women then publicly vocalized abhorrence toward the practice, which I think has been ongoing since 1965. But many were proud of it, arguing that it is a way to prove sexual morality. Certified as sexually moral, policewomen could then irrefutably position themselves as able to police sexual morality among citizens. So taken together, these events are indicative of Indonesia's ongoing moral turn. For instance, policewomen and their supporters fought for the right to wear the veil because they felt that wearing the veil was a way for them to showcase a moral self. Similarly, the fact that virginity testing is still practiced during police recruitment today, combined with the fact that some policewomen supported it and only a few publicly stated their opposition to it, shows that morality is of central importance. Policewomen must show they are moral and can protect their own and others' morality. The next source of evidence to suggest an immoral turn comes from 2016. Indeed, 2016 might be remembered for 2 not unrelated events in respect to Indonesia's moral turn: the LGBT crisis and the blasphemy trial of then Jakarta Governor Ahok. Much has been written about both of these events, making clear they indicate exponential growth in Indonesia's morality focus. In short, the LGBT crisis, as it became known, saw radio and TV shows banned from airing programs presenting LGBT identities as acceptable. The rejection of UN funding earmarked to support LGBT communities, and it saw numerous anti-LGBT protests that police refused to disrupt, and we can see that here on the left. While the anti-LGBT protests were dwarfed by the anti-Ahok protests, seen here on the right, they both made clear that anything interpreted as being against Islam, whether homosexuality or blasphemy, was now a legitimate target of violent action. By the end of 2016, any illusion of the separation of state, religion, and sexuality had shattered. In 2017, Indonesia's Constitutional Court narrowly rejected a petition to make extramarital sex illegal in a 5-4 vote. The court rejected the petition, noting that such a change fell outside their remit, and suggested the petition be presented instead to Parliament. The inference was that the court did not disagree with the petition per se, but merely determined it was outside their jurisdiction. More evidence of Indonesia's moral turn came in 2019, when revisions to many of the 628 articles contained in Indonesia's criminal code were mooted. Proposed revisions included criminalising consensual sex outside of marriage, increasing penalties for insulting Islam and the president, and weakening the power of the Anti-Corruption Commission. While the bill was postponed by President Joko Widodo in response to thousands of people rallying against it, there was little protest against sexuality-related revisions. In other words, people were protesting against the weakening of anti-corruption actions, not against the potential criminalisation of sex outside of marriage. And it's interesting that in Western media, the anti-corruption and penalties for insulting the president and Islam weren't picked up. It was reported as this Bali bonking bill because the West was much more focused with that. In 2020, a further proposal pushing to criminalise consenting sexual activity outside marriage was put forth, and it's known as the Family Resilience Bill. The bill also proposed a raft of other things, such as mandating that a wife and husband love each other. This article screenshot here from last month shows the House continues to debate the bill. Meanwhile, the progressive anti-sexual violence bill has stalled in Parliament. This bill would criminalise sexual violence, but opponents argued that its ratification would destroy marital harmony and encourage promiscuity. How the bill would encourage promiscuity is not clear, but the suggestion appears to be that if sexual violence is made illegal, and therefore all sexual violence stops, women and men will start having free sex because they no longer need to worry about violence. In other words, it is the threat of violence that stops people having sex outside of marriage. So I want to look now at some of the drivers of this immoral turn, this push to regulate and criminalise it and bring into public discussion all of these moral issues framed around morality. The single most obvious driver of Indonesia's moral turn is the increasing power and influence of conservative Islam. But many other drivers are enabling the amplification of Islam. And indeed, in many cases, these other drivers are using Islam to meet their own illiberal ends. There are lots of these drivers, but here I want to talk about 4 drivers, and I've written a new Mandela about this. So we have here the first, which is religion. When Maruf Amin, seen here with Jokowi, former chair of the Conservative Ulama Council of Islam, was appointed Vice President of Indonesia in 2019, further repression of sexual and reproductive rights became inevitable. While President Joko Widodo needed initial persuading that Maruf was the man for the job, 20 years of democratic reform had, ironically perhaps, provided the conditions whereby Maruf perfectly balanced a nationalistic Islamic ticket. While free from the restrictions President Suharto had placed on Islam during his rule from 1965 until 1998, presidencies after 1998 maintained a careful separation between state and religion, partly because they didn't want their power diluted. The presidency of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono from 2004 to 2014, however, provided opportunities for Islamic influence to grow, as James Hostry has shown. In 2010, the Constitutional Court's endorsement of the blasphemy law and its support by Muslim organisations and political parties previously considered nationalistic, including Yudhoyono's, revealed the closing gap between Islam and nationalist politics, and the respective work of Simon Butt and Melissa Crouch has explored this. So by the time of the 2019 presidential election, and in the wake of Ahok's blasphemy trial, Islamic credentials proved essential for electability, and Maruf had these in spades. Another aspect of the religious drivers of the immoral turn is that key religious figures within politics have benefited from the support of influential Islamist groups working on the periphery of politics. And as Kartika Varagor has argued, they make the most of enormous amounts of Saudi money. Other influential groups have also pushed a religious agenda. For instance, the militant Islamic Defenders Front and the very benignly named Family Love Alliance have both been prime drivers of Indonesia's moral turn. The Family Love Alliance's narrative of building strong families through criminalising non-marital sexuality has had success in part because the movement has co-opted people in positions of power and influence, including politicians and professors. The Alliance's influence suggests both the growing intolerance and also that educated conservative Muslims are using positions of power to drive the moral turn. So we also have educational drivers then. In 2013, Indonesia implemented a new curriculum with many laudable goals, including producing tolerant, socially sensitive, democratic, and responsible future citizens. Yet digging deeper reveals many contradictions and makes clear that Indonesia's education system in general does little to actively produce tolerant citizens. In religious studies, for instance, Limpaka has shown that the general aim seems to be increasing piety, not tolerance. Education within Islamic boarding schools are likely to produce even less tolerant graduates, especially as these students have little opportunity to interact with non-Muslims, as Ben Laksana has argued. A further concern is the fact that leading advocates for criminalising non-marital sexuality are found in the highest echelons of public universities, positions that then legitimate their homophobia. Without a deep sense of tolerance and respect for difference, students graduate feeling entitled to discriminate against those framed as morally other. A further educational driver of the moral turn is Indonesia's low-quality sexual and reproductive health education. The pervasiveness of misinformation was displayed earlier this year when an Indonesian commissioner publicly stated that a type of super sperm could impregnate women swimming in public pools. Such misinformation plays into the hands of those pushing for sexual morality to be policed at a national level. And there's also political drivers. The early years of democratic reform in Indonesia signalled hope for sexual rights. The Human Rights Commission was given increased power, and the National Commission on Violence Against Women was inaugurated. One of the ironies of democracy, though, is that while minority rights might be theoretically protected, space is also made for hatred and vitriol. After 2 decades of democracy, Indonesia is witnessing, as Greg Feely, Ed Aspinall, Marcus Meitzner, and others have shown, democratic stagnation and even democratic regression, driven by political elites and anti-reformists, many of whom have re-emerged from previous power structures. 2 drivers of the moral turn are relevant here: populism and authoritarian innovation. As Meitzner has argued, populism seemingly dominates Indonesia's contemporary political landscape. And by exploiting its characteristics, those with power and influence and those trying to achieve such have positioned people who have sex outside of marriage as the immoral enemy. The immoral are anti-Pancasila, which is Indonesia's guiding ideology, and the immoral form a dangerous, faceless movement waging a proxy war against families and masculinity in an effort to disintegrate national integrity. Nostalgia for pre-democratic stability is leveraged to further direct anxieties against the immoral. The use of such populist rhetoric to frame and malign the immoral has achieved incredible traction, in part due to authoritarian innovations, wherein, as Matzner shows, democratic values in Indonesia are co-opted into the aid of illiberal ends. The moral turn is full of authoritarian innovations. For instance, discussion of the problem of LGBT has moved from a rhetoric of persecution to one oozing with democratic care, rehabilitation, and pity, as the work of Ben Hegarty and others has shown. And the last factor I want to talk about today is the social factors that are pushing the immoral turn. And including social media. So 40% of Indonesia's 270 million citizens are active social media users. While social media has the potential to promote progressive ends, it often works against social justice. And the hashtag, the 2016 trending Twitter hashtag Tolak LGBT or Reject LGBT suggests this harm. Indeed, throughout 2016, the social media landscape filled with LGBT hate speech. And on cue, my children have come home. Hello? You have to be quiet and go somewhere. Bye. Where's at work? No lollies, right, go. Bye. Look, now you're on a screen with lots of people. No, I am literally, you need to go.
We're just taking him to the store to get the Halloween decoration.
Sorry.
Shut up.
Right, they've left. Indeed, throughout 2016, the social media landscape filled with LGBT hate speech. Social media platforms that had provided space for LGBT solidarity were banned by the government, as were words with mistress of pelakor, which Nellie Martin has written about. And as Joni Lariat has shown, once shamed on social media, there is no way to remove the permanent record. A further social factor driving the moral turn in Indonesia relates to framing the moral person, both the ways that people present themselves as moral and what leads others to judge someone else as moral or not. Markers of morality are heavily inscribed on the bodies of women, and the veil forms one of the most contested. Sometimes a woman in a veil is automatically considered a moral person, but at other times not. For instance, in France, where some types of veils are banned, a veiled woman may be seen as going against the national norm or considered a victim of her husband's or her father's desire to control her. And in France, currently, I think, I thought I would find a meme of this or something, but I think a woman can break the law for covering her face with an Islamic veil, but she can also break the law by not covering her face with a mask because of COVID, which just shows the preposterous nature of contesting the veil. So in Indonesia, the veil has come to signify the moral woman. In 2014, one survey suggested 64% of Indonesian women wear the veil. But any casual observation today suggests this percentage is higher. There are many other ways too that Indonesians must present themselves in order to be considered moral. For instance, self-help groups teach people, especially women, how to present themselves as moral citizens. And the respective research of Carla Jones and Daramir Radnicki have shown. Further, celebrity preachers also encourage moral appearance and behaviour, as Julian Milley has written about. New forms of conspicuous consumption, including types of Islamic dress, also encourage the public display of morality. The message is reinforced. The moral person is pious and never has sex outside of marriage. Now, I wanted to have a few slides just on the consequences of COVID-19 on the drive to push morality into punitive public discourse. And those consequences have been dire, and I want to mention just two: diverting health resources and justifying surveillance. So first, the impact of the moral turn has had devastating effect, not just on the LGBT community, who have been the primary target, and Henry Julius has written a lot about that. But now with COVID-19, these devastating impacts are increasing. And it's not just those framed as immoral who are wearing this impact. As Najma's PhD research has shown, HIV is increasing amongst married mothers, a group imagined in the public consciousness as the most moral of citizens. With the diversion of funding away from HIV due to COVID-19, mothers and their children will likely experience higher rates of HIV. And second, COVID-19 has motivated and justified increased punitive surveillance. We don't yet have a great deal of empirical data on COVID-related surveillance, specifically related to sexual minorities. But Ben Hegarty and I will hopefully get some in the future. But we know that COVID has justified surveillance of groups and people to make sure people wear masks, do physical distancing. So it is likely that this increased surveillance has negatively impacted marginalised communities for whom authorities and neighbours can justify increased surveillance. So, almost at the end, but I didn't want to leave you all on an entirely bleak note. And in fact, there are many incredible uplifting stories. And I want to mention one here in respect to the moral push and COVID-19. And this relates to the ways various grassroots communities have responded to issues of sexual and reproductive health in times of COVID. For instance, small communities have rallied together to crowdsource PPE and other essential supplies. And this has been particularly evident amongst the rainbow community. Diego Rodriguez, Dario Tomo, Irwan Hirayana have written and shared experiences of that. And further, Najma has written about how small communities have worked together to disseminate information about protecting reproductive health in a time of COVID. So there are glances of good things, good responses to this. So just to sum up then, there is clear evidence of a moral turn in Indonesia that has been growing in pace and vitriol since the early years of democratic reform. A perfect storm of factors have come together to force this turn. Religion, education, politics, and social factors are important, as are many others such as law, inequality, and globalization. While conservative Islam is usually touted as the cause of the moral turn, it is in fact all the aforementioned factors together motivating and enabling the moral turn. The turn has all but resulted in the criminalisation of sex outside marriage. Sex outside marriage has become the marker par excellence of immorality. To be sure, people have found ways of creating safe space and creating community and pushing back against this. But to bring us back to the omnibus law, which I started with, authorities knew Indonesians would protest the passing of this law. And in fact, the National Police Chief told the police to conduct online surveillance on activists and ban all kinds of rallies. And so this is showing how it's feeding into other types of controls. And it's this push towards punitive surveillance that is particularly worrying for so many. And on that note, I will leave it there, and hopefully we can continue the discussion through the Q&A or chat function.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Davies. That was an incredibly interesting presentation. So I'm going to open up with the first question. That mirrors what I just said. It's from Richardson. Thank you, Professor Davies, for the compelling talk. I'm reminded of the case of, and just know for the rest, I'm going to mispronounce everything that's not based in the US. Gunung Kemukus, the so-called Sex Mountain in central Java, which originated as a local pilgrimage site, but became known for its sex rituals. The provincial government has since banned the rituals, resulting in the loss of livelihoods for businesses in the area. Do you think policies like this risk suppressing traditional local culture among Indonesia's ethnic groups in favor of Islamic culture? And in case, because it is sort of a longer question and many of these questions are longer, you can open the Q&A yourself too if you want to read it.
Thank you. Yeah, no, a great question. And I was talking yesterday with Michael for the podcast about how I'm a history major, and so many of us seem to be, but that really guided my, and has continued to guide my research. And one of the really compelling and interesting parts of Indonesia is its history of gender and sexual diversity. And one of my favorite stories is sometime in the 1600s, 1700s, you know, missionaries were coming from other parts of the world trying to convince local rulers to convert to Christianity or Islam. And so there's recounts of this kind of bargaining from delegates from Islam and delegates from Christianity trying to convince local leaders, you know, come and be Muslim, come and be Christian. And it was Bisu, so a transgender type shaman priest, who held the power in terms of whether they would become Christian or Muslim. And actually the Bisu found the arguments of Islam most compelling, and they felt that their subject positions would most happily fit with Islam as opposed to Christianity. And so, you know, Sulawesi, parts of it converted to Islam because people then found Islam very accommodating for their gender diversity. And so now if we skip forward to 2020 and Islam is being used to persecute these identities that accepted Islam in the first place, is a real shame, because there is space for that kind of diversity, and there's space for that in religion. We just saw yesterday that the Pope has said, you know, homosexuals are God's people. So, you know, if the Pope can come out finally in 2020 and acknowledge that, you know, it's not necessarily religion that is disenabling this, it's the interpretations of that. So yes, to answer the question, yes, different things are being used to sideline culture and traditional beliefs.
Thank you. Let us turn to the next question, which is from Rafadi Hakim. And the question is, what sort of political alliances have been made between political parties and LGBT advocates? For instance, what kind of acknowledgement the LGBT rights have the nationalist parties done? Thank you.
Yeah, there's not been much headway in terms of political space for queer communities. There, Gatty was shortlisted for the Human Rights Commissioner, and should have made it but didn't. And one of the reasons was, being, you know, an outspoken gay man, they didn't think Indonesia was ready for that. So, to my knowledge, there has been no great input allowed from rainbow communities into politics in Indonesia. There's a very little space, and it must be done, you know, LGBT lives have to be generally done much under the radar without causing any kind of overt offence. So we're not seeing that kind of a system where, again, just recently sitting here in New Zealand, you know, it now has the queerest parliament in the world, according to my Twitter feed. So there has, in other places, been a real recognition of the contribution that diverse caucuses can make to politics, but I haven't seen any evidence of that in Indonesia.
All right. The next question is, I really like this question coming up. It's from an anonymous attendee, mysterious, but from a Western perspective, these changes and the increase of moral policing are abhorrent. I completely agree. And during a time when so much hate is coming out of the woodwork, especially here in the US, I feel exhausted. How do you stay engaged and committed to your scholarship and sustain your passion for this part of the world?
Yeah, there is. I mean, there is just so much bad news out of the world at the moment. It is quite hard to find energy and passion for things, because even, you know, in you know, what many would like to think of as a gleaming example of democracy in the US is just having so many issues with all sorts of things. And so how do we, you know, as researchers, as advocates, as allies of all sorts of campaigns maintain, you know, passion and enthusiasm and hope, really. And I think it is, which I just, you know, talked about so briefly, and usually I have a bit of a rant to get it off my chest and make it known more broadly, but maybe that is part of the story that should be shared more frequently, of the really amazing grassroots things that are happening. And so what happens in response to COVID in Indonesia is other countries might be expecting the government to do something. Indonesia, often people are not necessarily waiting for the government to do something. They know at a grassroots community level, they have to do it themselves, and that's what we see examples of. There's been incredible work amongst trans communities, very small scale, just getting small donations here and there, pooling their resources to help each other out. And so the ways that communities have come together, often at these very small levels outside of government awareness and government care, really, I think that gives me hope and passion that, you know, the world will be, you know, a good place. We just have to keep working towards that and showcasing a lot of the work that is happening there. They get sidelined with the big, you know, terrible headlines, but under that there's a lot of good work being done by a lot of good people, so that can give us hope.
Thank you so much. I noticed that the Q&A tab keeps on reshuffling the order of questions. So we apologize to people whose questions are getting lower in the tab. We will make sure that they're addressed. But just for the convenience of Cheryl, for her to see the question, let me keep on going how the tab is running. So the next question will be from Wendy Erb. And the question goes as, amazing talk, Cheryl, thank you. I'm wondering how the immoral turn is expressed in the Islam minority parts of archipelago. A similar cultural trends occur in places like Papua or Flores. Oh,
that's lovely. And it's so nice to hear from you, Wendy. It's lovely. I mean, it's this kind of odd thing where you can't see who is out there, but Wendy was a Fulbrighter who came to visit us in New Zealand when she was doing work in Indonesia. So that's lovely to see you there, and a great question. And Papua, I think, is the most heavily policed place on the planet. Indonesia has the 4th largest police force, and a significant proportion of that is deployed to Papua to ensure surveillance, to ensure control, to ensure no separatist movements get out of hand. And so any kinds of expression of anything that is considered immoral or disruptive or that could threaten national integrity in Papua is just over police, full stop. And Flores is an interesting question. I actually don't know. Some places that are a little bit far enough away can, you know, negotiate away from the overt surveillance. And again, there is this very top-down overt surveillance, which COVID and, you know, surveillance in general has been encouraging neighbours to police other neighbours. So with this omnibus law, the police have said, you know, encourage vigilantism, really. And so that can happen in these further removed communities, that vigilantism is encouraged and invoked, and we see this kind of stuff happening in other places as well. So Flores, that could be happening, but it could also be, you know, if you're in a tight community where people know each other, there can be a lot more tolerance and support for neighbours and communities and for difference with those stronger community structures. So it'd be interesting to find out, Flores, more for sure.
All right, next question. I think Chris had his, and for some reason it got bumped down. And it goes on a very similar tone of the question that was just asked. It says, "Hi Sharyn, thank you for a great presentation. We haven't met in person, but it's Chris Lundy from Colmex. I'm curious if you've been watching further marginalized groups such as Papuans, who may be members of ethnic, religious, sexual minority at the same time, and who are also suffering under COVID." So I think you kind of touched a little bit on it on your answer already.
Yeah, there's just multiple layers of repression, and Papua, I mean, it's not only over policed, incredibly heavily policed, but it's drained of healthcare services. So they're really stretched in Indonesia to start with. So part of the less than excellent response by Indonesia in terms of COVID is just, it just does not have the capacity and capability for dealing with COVID. And so that strips away healthcare that would be provided potentially to ethnic or religious or sexual minorities, gets diverted often to the center, to, you know, the types of people that deserve to be saved in the national rhetoric. So yeah, there's very little good news for groups, particularly in Papua and elsewhere.
Next question will be from Tamara Luz here at Cornell. And the question goes, "Thank you, Cheryl, and it's lovely to see you live, and we appreciate you making the time to speak with us. I'm always struck by the focus of laws and moral codes, social norms on women. Can you talk a bit about controls placed on men? Does anyone wonder how married women or mothers are experiencing an increase in HIV? I realize the simple answer is that the law aims to control women's sexuality and not men's, but I believe there is something deeper going on with regard to who bears morality, who burdens with culture in their very bodies."
Oh, great, and lovely to see you there tomorrow. I've read lots of your work, so that's really lovely that you're here. And great question. And part of the issue, I referred to a PhD by Najma on looking at HIV amongst mothers, and HIV rates amongst women, married mothers who heterosexual, who don't use intravenous drugs, are rising faster proportionately to any other group. And this is partly because they're envisaged as impossible recipients. You know, they must be so moral. How could they get HIV? We don't need to have any testing or provision for them. But who gets completely missed out of that equation is their husbands, because the husbands aren't imbued with the same kind of morality that the wives are. And of course, you know, on the one hand, there's the narrative that nobody should have sex outside of marriage. But under that is, of course, well, you know, men, of course, will have sex outside of marriage, and that's just men being men. And so why the rates of HIV amongst women are increasing so much is because their husbands will be having unprotected sex. So now condoms can be used in a court of law as proof of sex outside of marriage. So sex workers don't necessarily want to use condoms because they can, you know, then be used as evidence. Men don't want to either. And so then they're coming home and passing on HIV to their wives, and the shame and stigma means nobody's talking about it. If you go to get a HIV test, the doctor may not even suggest it, because to suggest that a wife needs a HIV test, you're implying that she's immoral in some way, or her husband is. So it's not doing that. So men are often left outside of that. And of course, police women have to undergo a virginity test, and policemen, you know, of course, don't. And there's no regulation that they kind of carry this moral burden on there. So lots of interesting ways, you know, the talk of no one should have sex outside of marriage, but the ways that gets inscribed on their bodies, men's and women's, and the burden then of that culture, as you say, gets lived in different ways.
All right, the next is not really a question. It seems to be a comment. If you wish to comment on that, you can. It's from, and apologize if I pronounce it wrong, I think it's Erwan. Today, Indonesia just signed the Geneva Consensus Declaration along with 32 countries which restrict abortion access and maintain family harmony. So this moral turn movement already influences government at the international level.
Yeah, wow. Oh, and thank you, Irwan. Is a co-author for the translated book that Linda Bennett and I did for that. So lovely to see you here, Irwan. And I didn't know that, so that's really interesting. So it's just signed the Geneva Consensus Declaration restricting abortion access, and that's. I mean, it's even difficult to get a condom in Indonesia. It's really difficult to get the pill in Indonesia, and now it's really difficult to get access to abortion. So it just again makes it very difficult for women in particular who have to carry all of these burdens. So that fits exactly, as we would expect the Indonesian government moving to be more restrictive on abortion access without having any decent sexual education at school. So that just is not a great move, and there's many other ways to provide help and support for a community than criminalizing that or making access to abortion more difficult.
Thank you. The next question is going to be from our graduate student here at Cornell, Nikita. What has been the response by the non-Muslim population in Indonesia and to this new pressure for moralization in the public sphere? Are their desires and moral perspectives in line with this greater turn? Has there been consensus, divide, response? Thank you.
Great. Irwan is probably sitting there with much better answers than I'm going to give to these questions. So the response of non-Muslims has been quite muted, and so the Ahok trial, he was the governor of Jakarta, and he wasn't Muslim, but he was adopted and raised by a Muslim family. He was a good friend of the current prime minister, and he said something from the Quran that was either he said it wrong or it was misinterpreted, but he ended up going to prison and lost his job. So it is very difficult for even Muslims to speak in a way that may not later they might be penalized for. And one of the big pressures I know for some of my friends who are Muslim is if they are choosing not to veil, the pressure for them to veil is really high. So this pressure to be, an ideal Muslim is felt by everybody, Muslims included, in that. And we saw that in the strategic choice of the president, in his vice president who had all of those Islamic credentials. And Jokowi didn't necessarily want Maruf to be the running mate, but the advice was, and it was good advice because he got re-elected, was that you needed someone with impeccable, Muslim credentials, and Maruf formed that. So I think it is hard on a national scale, more successful likely in places like Bali where there's a strong, a majority non-Muslim population, but pitching into the national discourse, it's very hard, I would think.
All right, the next one is from, I get all the anonymous attendees. The next one is from an anonymous attendee. It's short and sweet. Sharyn, how do you relate the stigma on COVID-19 on the morality of health workers with COVID-19 and stigma in Indonesia?
Yeah, stigma is such an issue. And even I went to the dentist here in New Zealand, and we've had, very few COVID cases, very few deaths, 23 or something altogether. And I went into the dentist and there was a question on there. Have you ever had COVID? Have you been in contact with anyone with COVID? And you just realize that if I had ticked yes to that they may not let me go to the dentist. And this was incredibly minor compared to, if I had to go to work and had to tick a form that said, have you had COVID? Have you come into contact? And if I'm thinking, you know, if I say yes, they're not going to let me work today. How am I going to get money? How am I going to feed my children? You know, what are my neighbors going to say if they think I have COVID? You know, if I have a babysitter next door, can I still send my kids there? So they're really real concerns of being able to say that you have COVID or you've come in contact with it. And the same with HIV. The repercussions of saying that you have HIV are just really detrimental, that people therefore don't necessarily disclose that information, and that makes, you know, treatment and recovery and support so much harder. So I think, you know, we need to find ways to overcome that, and in New Zealand they're very careful to not show the faces of people. You know, there's been a couple of cases lately, but they don't say names or they don't say faces because they know of that stigma, but it's not the same elsewhere. So it makes it difficult on all types of levels, from people, you know, acknowledging that they have it and seeking help, and then having community and national responses.
And I think we're picking up the last question for tonight. Thank you, Professor. Oh, sorry. The question is from Hamza Muzaini. Thanks, Professor Davies. My question: how does the state balance its increasingly draconian law with the need to still promote tourism and invite investment into the country? What sort of backlash has the global community given against these laws, and how has the Indonesian government sought to deal with this?
Yeah, great question. And we saw when Indonesia was putting forward these changes to the criminal code, one of which would ban sex outside of marriage, the Australian media in particular, because Bali is the holiday destination, the Australian government and citizens put incredible pressure on Indonesia not to have that law, because Australians didn't want to go on holiday in Bali if they had to take a marriage certificate, and if they were worried about being arrested because they were caught in a bedroom with someone who wasn't their marital partner. And so the narrative in Australia became that it had effectively persuaded Indonesia to stop this Bali bonking bill because of tourism. So, you know, it was far more complicated than that, and people in Indonesia weren't really concerned with the Bali bonking bill. They were more concerned with the corruption and the ability to still critique the government. But that tourism thing is a big mover, and at the moment, of course, you know, the largest number of foreigners to Indonesia come from Australia, and there's just no flights apart from a very few repatriation flights. So the tourism dollar can be really influential, but at the moment, you know, there's not that. And I think partly many people are uninformed about Indonesia, so they don't necessarily know what is happening there. But some of those big events that happen in Indonesia do really impact the number of tourists who are going there. So, you know, I think it is wise also for Indonesia to be thinking about its kind of reputation outside, to ensure that when we can all fly and travel again, that tourism does go back to benefit Indonesia.
Thank you so much. Before we close, please have a look in the chat, because Connor just announced that they're chairing the 20th, him and his colleagues are chairing the 20th Northeast Conference on Indonesia this weekend. And there will be some panels related to COVID. So feel free to check the link in the chat. And after this announcement, let me thank Professor Davies so much for this wonderful talk. It was absolute pleasure. And we hope to see everybody next week, Thursday. Again, it will be the daytime presentation. So US, New York Eastern Standard, what is it? Time will be 12:40. So yeah, thank you so much for spending this evening with us, or morning.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.